Hello, my name is Zvi Lew, and I am giving this shir Le'iloi Nishmas Sar Rivka Bas Rav Nachum Mendel. The shir is on Psalm 38, Mizmor Lamed Ches. In this Mizmor, basically David is crying out to Hashem. It says Mizmor LeDavid Lehazkir. David is giving a mizmor to mention. What is he mentioning? So there's a debate amongst the different mefarshim. Most of them say David is talking about himself, his personal yisurim, that he had to go through. David, because of the sin of Bathsheba, Chazal say that he had saras for many months, and that a lot of Ruach HaKodesh may have been taken from him, and therefore he was crying over his own pain. And this becomes, as many of the Mefarshim say, something which everyone's supposed to use, this particular mizmor, to get rid of their pain and to get rid of their suffering by saying this particular mizmor and by using this tefillah. Rashi also brings up that this is actually not about an individual, about David, but it actually happens to be about all of Klal Yisrael, meaning it's a tefillah for tzara, for all of Klal Yisrael, for all of their pain, and that's being said now. And as an introduction, the Meiri writes that this mizmor is basically broken up into two parts. The first part being the part where he cries out about his pain and talks about his suffering and asks God to forgive him, and the second one talks about how his enemies are laughing at him. And his enemies love the fact that he is in pain. And what needs to be taken care of here is what David wants, is he knows that he's suffering because of what he did, but he wants them to know that it's not out of God's hatred, is what the enemies think, is what the enemies believe, but it is actually out of God's love for him, and it's just God is doing this because of the fact that he sinned and God's trying to get him back in the right place. And that's why he's saying, God, I want you to make sure that you treat this as rachamim, as mercy, so they can see it's not out of hatred. So that is why the Mizmor then continues and mentions, Hashem al bekatzvcha sochicheni, Hashem, please in your anger don't be mochiach me. And in your anger, don't make me suffer, don't make me have pain. And the Malbim explains that this basically is because there's two types of anger. There's af and ketzef. Here he uses the word ketzef, which means anger that comes immediately, that's taken immediately. But then there's a second type of anger, which is the anger of chema. Chema is an anger that lasts, that lingers, and you don't feel the effects until much later. So he says, please don't, Malbim says, please God, don't sit there with your immediate anger and try to give me tochacha, try to rebuke me by showing me, by saying to me, I want you to be on the right path. Don't give me that type of anger and make me suffer. And don't give me the chema, which usually with the second type of anger, which lasts forever, that usually you can see it later, since it comes at a later point, that comes as a punishment. So he says, please don't do that. And then the psukim continue, Ki chitzecha nichasu bi, v'tinchas ala yadecha. That your arrows are hitting into me, and you put your hand on me. And the Malbim explains there were two pains that David had. One was an inner spiritual turmoil, and that inner spiritual turmoil which he had was one punishment, and that's like the arrows going inside him. It's penetrating deep inside and hurting him on a more emotional, psychological, spiritual level. And then it mentions that Hashem puts his hand on him and actually caused him pain, which is that, as he talked about, of his tzaras. And he says, that basically hurt me over there. And he says, Ein mesom bibsari in Pasuk Dalet. Ein mesom bibsari mipnei zamecha. There is no end of my pain in my flesh because of your anger, which again is the physical pain. And Ein Shalom Batzamayim B'Pnei Chatasi. There's no peace in my bones because of my sin, which again is talking about the deep emotional pain that is there. And then it says, he goes on in Pasuk Hey, and says, Ki avanasai avru roshi, my sins are so hard for me, they're hard for my head, they've passed over my head, Ki masa kaved yichbedu mimeni, like a very hard, heavy weight, which is too heavy for me, which is more than I can stand. So the Meiri, in his Perish on Perek Avos, explains, in his Perish on Tehillim, explains that this really means, the word mimeni means from me, from my essence. What is my essence? My essence, in fact, is my intellect, my ability to do mitzvos. And my sins, that means that my sins have done more, have been heavier, have been more problematic than my zechuyos, than my right attributes, than exactly what I'm doing well. And that is exactly what he's saying here, that my essence, which is my goodness, my mitzvos, my intellect, that is not coming through, that is not actually happening because I'm sinning. My sinning is there, and that is causing me too much pain. That is overtaking my goodness. And I realize, again, he's admitting that about his sins. And then he continues to talk about more about his sins, that hivishu namaku chavrasai mipnei ivalti. Basically, my wounds have become painful and rotten. Navisi shachosi ad ma'od kol yom koder halachti. All day I'm basically walking, I'm going about with bleakness, with nothingness. And ki chasalai malu niklev ein mebsom bibsari. Again, there's no end to my pain. There's no end to what's going on. So then he continues going on to kind of a second point, which is, he gets to, through Pasuk Tes, another Pasuk Yud, he says, Hashem negdecha kol tavasi v'anchasi mimcha lo nistara. I have all my desires in front of you, Hashem, and my sighs from you are not hidden. So what does it mean that I have all my desires in front of you? So one explanation is Rashi says, all my needs, everything that I need, all that I need to continue on, you know what I need. You know what I need in order to be forgiven, in order to be healed. You know exactly what I need. But the Meiri says it in a little bit of a different idea. He says, my desires, he says, you should know, my desire is not a personal thing. You know my desire is not for me, but it's for you, God. It's only for you that I'm doing this. And therefore you should forgive me because I'm only doing this for the sake of Hashem. And then he continues on saying Pasuk Yud Bet. So Pasuk Yud Aleph, which says, Libi secharcha azavani kolchi, my strength has forsaken me, v'orenai gam hein einiti. And the light of my eyes, meaning my strength, my ability, my desire, is not with me. And then it goes to Pasuk Yud Bet, where it gets to the second part, where it talks about his connection with his enemies. My close ones, my friends, stand in front of me. They don't stand with me. They stand, once I got my nigun, once I got my problems, they're kind of leaving me. And they're not staying with me. And the people who are close to me have gone far away. And the question is exactly what that means. So one idea is, of course, that they're not helping me, they're not giving me advice. But maybe even worse, as Rashi says, they were only real with me, as he calls it, b'shas hanasan, when they had a time where they could get something and get their desires and get their benefit from me. But at a point where I'm sick, they did not want to become close to me. And he's trying to say that he didn't feel that at that point that some of his close ones had the true level of friendship which we're supposed to have, which is to be there through and throughout, but they weren't necessarily helping me in the way that they should have. And then it says, Vayinakshu mivyakshem nafshi v'darshe rasi debru havos remos kol hayom yihagayo. And the people who basically don't like me have left traps, and they do treacheries all day, and they only think about deceit. And Vani kecheresh lo ashma v'chilem lo yiftach. I act like a person who can hear, a deaf person, and like a mute person, I don't open my mouth. And why is David not opening his mouth? So again, it's basically to say that one point is that the Jewish idea to suffer albono, to suffer sins, that is something that is a basic Jewish idea, that we don't sit there in the face of somebody yelling at us and somebody trying to make us suffer. We don't sit there and we take it. We take it because of the fact that we want to show that we only care about what Hashem thinks and we don't care about what other people think. And the Meiri says David had a point where he said, I can't really reject what they're saying. It's just I just don't want them to think it's out of sin. As we said before, I want them to think it's out of God just wanting me to do the right thing. And Rashi, who talks about, as we said in the beginning, about all of Klal Yisrael, says basically that Bnei Yisrael are quiet in general. Why are they quiet? Because, as he continues in Ted Zayin, Ki lecha Hashem hochalti ata saneh Hashem Elokai. You are Hashem, I'm with, and I'm only with you. I don't need to be with anybody else. Ki amarti penyas mechuvi, pasuk Yudzayin, Ki amarti penyas mechuvi b'mot ragli alai higdilu. I'm going to say maybe they will become happy with what I have. They will become happy with what's going on to me. And they will, and basically what's going to happen is that they're going to be happy. I'm going to sit there and say, I believe in God. And when they see me falling, they will say that that's something which they expected and our Yeshua is not coming. And then he continues on by saying, in Pasuk Yutes, Kavani agid edag mechatasi. I'm worried about my sins. Vay chayim atzemu Pasuk Chaf. Vay chayim atzemu v'rabu sanai sheker. You see, basically they continue. The enemies continue to grow, and even though they do bad, they sit there and they don't. Even though the enemies do bad, they don't. Nothing happens to them. They just grow. And what happens in Mishamai Ra Tachas Tova in Pasuk Chafal? Mishamai Ra Tachas Tova, they do bad instead of good to me, right? And they hate me because of the way I do good. So Rashi explains that because we do mitzvahs as Klal Yisrael, basically they hate us, and the Radak mentions that they're jealous. They're completely jealous of the fact, the connection that we have with God. So therefore, they want to ensure that we don't get to be successful because they're upset about the fact that we're doing the mitzvahs and they're not accomplished with that either. And the people who don't like us. And the Meiri says again, the fact that Radfi Tov means that I love Torah. The fact that I'm running after Torah, the fact that that's there, that's wonderful. But also the fact that they gave them Tochacha, I wanted them to do Torah, and that's what they're upset about. And then it ends up with the famous line, Al tazvein Hashem ha'elokai al terchak imeni. Don't leave me, Hashem, don't go too far away from me. Chushal ezrasi Hashem tishuvasi. Listen to my help, give me the help that I need. Hashem, you are my salvation. So Hashem, this is what we say in order to have HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us the proper salvation.